consideration on getting through this year. Next, please. So, this, I had to take a picture of this. That's John D'Antonio and Krista Green from the Interstate Stream Commission. We were traveling to a meeting in California, and we happened to end up in the airport in Las Vegas together as a stopover, and we all went to lunch. And we sat around the table, and I couldn't resist taking a picture of water is not boring. I can assure you there's nothing boring about water. Next, please. So a little bit about AWRM. And I'm learning my way around this. I've been following it from the outside, but certainly now from inside the agency, we've got to collectively all deal with it. The Supreme Court issued its decision on November 1st of this year. And what it was relative to was the New Mexico legislative statutory authority that they did in 2003. And what the legislature basically said, working with our office, is these adjudications take a long time, 10, 20 years or more, but the need to administer in times of drought, like we're in right now, is immediate. We need the ability to work with folks so we get through that drought that year. And so they basically, working with the legislature, said, go find the mechanisms to do that. So in 2004, there was a round of rules promulgated out of that recommendation. And in 2005, it was challenged by, if I recall, 3 parties. They were Tri-State Energy, the Mexico Mining Association, and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, took it to district court and said, we think portions of this are unconstitutional. In 2006, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District withdrew from the suit, and the district court did say, we concur. We think elements of the power that you're trying to give to the state engineer, or the state engineer already has, we find some of that unconstitutional. So the office appealed it, and shortly after that, the New Mexico Mining Association also withdrew from the suit. And the Court of Appeals affirmed the district court's ruling and said, we agree. We think there are some components of that are unconstitutional. Again, the office, back in, I think, 2006, appealed that decision. All the testimony was taken roughly a year ago. I think it was the 2nd and 3rd of November last year. So almost a year to the day, the Supreme Court reversed both of those rulings and said, we think the state engineer either already had or needed to have the ability to do those things. And that's where we find ourselves today. What does that mean to all of us? There's fear out there that this is a lot of power in the hands of one agency. And I can assure you that from my point of view, the intent of, now that we get to deal with it, the intent of it's not a power grab. The intent of it is to try and do a couple of things in my mind. One is, what do we do in this interim period between the time a basin is declared and the adjudication is complete? It takes so much time. How do we step through a set of sequential best data available in order to administer or provide, if the entities get together and say, we'd rather not do a strict priority enforcement, how can we work together to do that? It provides us the latitude to do it in both directions. That's the way I see it. So here's what we're going to be doing. You can imagine even our staff is saying, what does this mean to us? What does this mean out in those district offices that work with all of you on a daily basis? And we've been talking to them and said, we're going to step through this a little bit slowly, but we would like to be ready to deal with it next year, should we have to. So we're going to revisit each one of those priority basins. I'll show you here on the map in just a second. Let's go to the next one, please. Now, that's not quite good. So there were 7 priority basins that were identified back when AWRM was being proposed. And I've got a map of them here in a minute. So, and there were draft rules put in place for how we would deal with each one of those basins. And we're going to pull them off the shelf, we're going to dust them off, we're going to go through and make sure that they still make sense the way that were proposed. A number of those basins, since 2003, things that have been accomplished in those basins that may change how the guidelines were set up for that particular area. And then we'll begin to work with the stakeholders in the area on how we move that forward and our district offices. So I would ask you to work with us. That's the intent of this, and I think it's a good thing. There's a lot of concern around New Mexico about whether it's not. I think it gives us some tools to work together rather than go to court all the time. To put it in perspective, this is how much water is withdrawn out of New Mexico annually. About 4 million acre feet subdivided into surface water and groundwater. Next, please. And for public water supplies, it's a much smaller portion of that overall total, 320,000 acre feet or so a year, divided into surface and groundwater. So you can see the dominant value there is groundwater. Next, please. So where's all that water go around New Mexico? And this is, again, a couple of years old. This is John Longworth's group puts this together every couple of years. You can see public water supply, roughly 8% of those totals. Self-supplied domestic, about 1%. Irrigated agriculture, a lot of what all of you do, they're interested in as part of that, about 78%. Commercial, livestock, industrial, mining, power, reservoir evaporation. So you could see the numbers on what we want. Next, please. So what are they? That's a picture of Elephant Butte when it had a whole lot more water in it than it does today. Any of you have had a chance to get down there lately? Both Elephant Butte and Caballo are very low. In fact, Elephant Butte's bottomed out to where it can't be taken lower now, other than what it loses to evaporation because of that conservation pool requirement. It really is intended to protect senior water rights. We also have 8 interstate compacts around New Mexico, and some of those are being challenged right now. If you've been following, the state of New Mexico has a lawsuit against the Bureau of Reclamation over how they're operating the Rio Grande project for Elephant Butte Irrigation District and El Paso Improvement District number 1. That's a tough spot for all of us to be. We have all these other good things going with the Bureau of Reclamation, and then we find ourselves where we have neighbors fighting against neighbors, and we have cities fighting against agriculture, and that's not a particularly good place to be. My hope is that we end up resolving that rather than it going completely through a litigation process as well. Curtail illegal diversions and over diversions, which is something we're talking about today. Next, please. So, these are slides that were being used by the agency when AWRN was proposed, and I just pulled them back up, and I think they're still relevant. It's an emergency action plan when we're in the middle of drought, and we are. And the projections, at least for this coming year, don't look like we're going to get much relief. I hope I'm wrong. Hope you invite me back next year and we can talk about how good a snow year we had. But the projections through this winter right now, through January, do not look very good. Next. That's probably pretty good advice. I think that's really what this is about. Next, please. And you can step through those, the 7 priority basins, if you don't mind. Yeah, just pull them up. I think there's 7 bullets. Around the state, gives you a picture of where they physically are located. Good examples of things that have changed in the lower Pecos. The adjudication was just delivered for the final order to the judge to make a decision about 2 weeks ago in Roswell. The lower Rio Grande has a lot of work's been done over crop use and how the pecan growers are going to what they can use, what the return flow is, and so forth. So again, as we pull these rules back off the shelf, we're going to be making sure that they make sense with regard to the things that have happened since 2003. Next, please. So why measure? There's a lot of concern out there. We hear about it all the time. I'm an old engineer, so it's easier for me to understand things when we measure it. Why do that? Well, in my mind, it provides certainty to everybody. It's more transparent. Anybody can go out and look and say, are we doing this right today, or tomorrow, and the next day? Over time, it reduces controversy. And not always right at the front, but over time it does. And a good example is the Costilla Compact, which is administered almost purely these days on priority. It's almost all agriculture, so it doesn't have these other interests in it. And when they went through that and settled the Costilla Compact and put it in priority administration, it has settled a lot of the controversy. It seems to be running very smooth these days. And one of the new hats I get to wear is the Rio Costilla Compact Commissioner for New Mexico with Colorado. And it seems to have made everybody work better together. So more consistency, it provides us long-term data as we watch drought continue and we have climate change. Then we have data on an annual basis that we can continually use in how we're administering that basis. And it provides us better management tools. Next, please. And this is where we have some of that ongoing. I'm not going to belabor this one. Gives you an idea of where we have real-time measurement around the state. I think probably this is an older slide. We have a few more places where that's working right now. Next, please. We see a lot of our staff in the room here. Also have interest in the Acequas, so it's great to have you here. I see Tim and George, and thanks for being here this morning. Next, please. So this is what we were talking about, district-specific regulations. They're already drafted. They were drafted some years ago and put on hold, though, when it went to the Supreme Court, when it went through the court process. We're going to be pulling those back up and working on this. Next, please. Those are the things I've just been talking about. I won't go over those again. You know this well. I'm sure many of you in this room were active in the discussions about AWRM. I don't know where the Acequia community came down on that. I can guess, maybe, where you might have. I think this is one of those areas where I really look forward to working with the Commission and the Association and Paula over how we do a good job of actually rolling this out as we need to. Next, please. So alternative administration that specifically identified in the statute, in the rules, are these things. You step. I think there's 4. Those are the areas that, if the entities get together and say, we're not sure we want to go down strict priority administration, we'd rather work with our neighbors and try to get through this year, this would be the way that it's done. I see a lot of you back here. How are you today? Next, please. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about capital outlay. How do we spend the state's money? And how good a job are we doing at that these days? This is kind of a pet interest of mine, having been out on that private side all these years. So what are the challenges? Why does anybody care? Obviously the drought has raised the level of interest in how the state's money is being spent. And where's all the free money gone? I can tell you, having just come back from this conference in Arizona over the last couple of days, it's not just an issue that's particular to New Mexico. The federal dollars are declining. I think Paula talked a little bit about the Corps of Engineers program that was in place to help Acequas in the past that's no longer there. That's a good example that we're seeing replicated across the nation right now. And I think that's the trend. The trend is going to be away from grants. The trend is going to be towards loans and financing and that kind of more technical support. The other thing that I've noticed, hopefully some of you have seen it the same way, is that the concept of planning has taken on a negative connotation. So it's like legislators are saying, why are we spending money and time on planning? Let's just go build it. And they're missing, in my mind, they're missing the importance of those early steps. Those of us that have spent careers doing that step understand that going through that saves time and money and implementation down the road. But not everybody gets that. So as we're revisiting the steps towards spending the state's money on these kinds of things, it's one of those ideas that we want to pull back to the table. Nobody disagrees with that. When you talk to the governor's office, when you talk to the legislators, when you talk to people out on the ground, nobody disagrees the importance of it. Getting there is the hard part. One of the elements that really has been hammered on heavily by the New Mexico Environment Department, Construction Programs Bureau, and their funding of water supply projects around the state, is the importance of having those three things in place: technical, managerial, and fiscal capacity. The single biggest thing that came up when we were in Arizona across the country is deferred maintenance, or the lack of asset management. You've got an asset now that's been built through some mechanism, and we're not doing a good job of having the mechanisms in place to manage that over the long haul. So 5 to 10 years after we built it, it's fallen apart. And we're back in front of the legislature to fund the same thing again. And what it means is our pot gets smaller. So rather than being smart about, it's sort of like one of those, it's buying my kid a car. If you tend to take care of those things that you own and you have ownership in. And so if there's no skin in the game, if there's no ownership in it, it's a human nature thing. We don't take as good a care of it. And I can tell you the taxpayers around the country right now are saying, if we're going to go invest in projects, we want to make sure that those projects last a long time. So that concept of asset management, operation and maintenance and replacement that needs to be built into the process is being talked about across all the agencies right now. And we want to work with you on that. I think that's the technical, managerial, and fiscal capacity, the ability to operate and manage. That's one of the things that the Acequas Association can be really helpful in doing, working with all of you, and helpful with us in translating that to all of you. And that we're looking at these projects over a life cycle, not just over that snapshot of building it the first time, but we're building it for the long haul. The other thing that I've been I'm a civil engineer, right? I've been doing this a long time, 34 years before I got appointed to this job. And I'm challenging the engineering and design community to design stuff that's appropriate for that entity. And one of my favorite stories is, I'm sort of picking on them, but Wagon Mound, New Mexico has their wastewater treatment plant is three evaporation lagoons. It can be operated with one person with a rake, and the energy costs are very low. You go replace that with some new MBR facility or activated sludge wastewater treatment plant, and their energy costs go up by a factor of 10. And they have to have hired certified operators now to run it. The combination of all those things makes it really difficult for those communities to keep that thing running over the long haul, and then we're back to that problem of managing the assets. So the challenge is that we're designing the appropriate stuff to everybody, and we're doing it the right way. And I think if we'll all march that direction together, the pot will get bigger rather than smaller. The other thing we don't do a very good job at in New Mexico is doing the hard work of prioritizing projects. So we say, it's kind of a cultural thing. Let's give everybody a little money to keep them happy this year, and we'll let them go get that much done this year. What it means is we have 400 plus infrastructure projects around New Mexico, millions of dollars tied up in phases that may never get done. So rather than doing the hard work of saying, let's go get this one all done this year, and that one all done next year, and that one all done next year. I'm willing to bet that we'll get them all done in the same period of time and at less cost in the pockets. So that's an educational thing for all of us. Willingness and ability to pay is a big issue. That's a Bureau Reclamation term, but again, we want to make sure that everybody that's a party to this, that the taxpayers' money that we're all relying on, is being spent appropriately. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about legislative attention. You know, one of the places the pushback comes for this kind of a process is from the legislature. That's their money. That's their money to spend. The way capital is divided up in New Mexico, and let's go to the next one, is sort of like this. Down in the lower left-hand corner, we divide it up amongst the governor's office and the House and the Senate, and then they further divide it up, and that's what folks have to take back to their districts. It was interesting when I brought this up with the 17 western states. All the other states just shook their heads and said, that looks really dysfunctional, how you spend your money. And nobody disagrees with that when you talk to them. Everybody agrees that's not the best way to do it, but how do we get to an improved process there? Where's the money come from? It comes from our taxpayers, and it comes from severance taxes. A big part of the money that we spend on infrastructure around New Mexico comes from the extractive industries, oil and gas and mining and those things. A large chunk of it. Water Trust Board is a good example. 10% of the state's bonding capacity rolls into that fund, and that's what gets spent on those projects. It comes from congressional actions. It comes from federal programs. The New Mexico Finance Authority, which is a quasi-public agency set up to try and provide subsidized financing to projects. And it comes from the private sector as well. We're in the process of updating the state water plan. And in doing so, we're looking at scale. We're looking at what is local scale, roles and responsibilities. What's regional scale, roles and responsibilities. And what kind of things should the state be taking on in the larger scale. And I look forward to having, Esteban Lopez and I, Esteban's the director of the Interstate Stream Commission, the staff that's working on the state water plan now has provided us a stack of draft chapters of the state water plan for us to go through first, and then we'll start rolling those out for public input and comment. I look forward to your weighing in on that along the way. So that's sort of the different versions of the scale. I'm a big believer in regionalization when it makes sense. Paula talked about, I've spent the last 12 years working on the Eastern New Mexico rural water system. That's 8 cities and counties that got together and said, let's develop our water plan together, rather than, these are communities that have been fighting forever, right? They've been fighting over football teams and school funding formulas and where Greyhound Stadium ought to be built and all kinds of stuff. They've been fighting forever. And it took us, no kidding, it took us about 2 years to get folks back to talking to one another. Once they did that, once they said, let's don't do this anymore, but let's go there together, they turned the corner. And that all started to make sense, and it's moved into, it's now, they've created an authority, and everybody's working together, and that effort is really valuable. I can tell you, when I'm talking to groups about regionalizing, I think you all benefit from it. I'm not quite sure how the Acequas community plays into that yet, but I want to have those discussions with you, because the sooner you can get to playing together, the better off you're going to be. Next, please. So here were some of the recurring themes at this Western States Water Council meeting this week. Planning is important. Let's don't skip that step, because we think we'll save its time and effort over time if we go through it. Value of water. I know several of us in this room were at the annual water conference down in Las Cruces. A series of panels during the course of the day where folks, different subjects, about every value of water you can imagine in New Mexico was represented that day. Everything from the very strong environmental community basically saying, you know, Scott, with your power as a state engineer, you can control population growth in New Mexico. You can decide who wins and loses. I don't think that's my job. And I don't look forward to trying to take on that kind of effort. So from that spectrum, all the way to the pure market-driven, water's a commodity, it should be able to flow wherever the dollars are, and we should get out of the way and let it flow that way, and everything in between. That was really interesting because every value of water was represented there. And I was taking a lot of notes. Deferred maintenance is a major problem. That, in my mind, is one of the largest single problems we have around the country. Is we go spend capital dollars on building something. We don't have the mechanisms or the rates or the process in place to keep it maintained and operated over its life. That life may be 20, 40, 50 years. And a few years in, we're back asking somebody to fund a replacement of that thing that we just paid for. And the pocket is smaller. We have limited resources. How do we prioritize where we're going to spend those dollars? And I can hear, somebody will give me a thumbs up when I run out of time, right? So I'm really fortunate that I get to sit on the governor's cabinet. And there's, 22 cabinet members, I think, and we're sitting in a cabinet meeting, and I'm listening to every other cabinet director talk about the things that they're working on. And what I'm thinking is, water is underpinning every one of those, right? Tourism, economic development, agriculture, Indian affairs, environment department, health. Every one of them has a water context. They're not thinking about it that way. And I think part of my job, part of our job, is to keep reminding them about the importance of that. When you talk to people about infrastructure and financing of infrastructure, they think about roads and rail and those kind of things. They typically don't think about water. Part of our job collectively is to keep bringing water back to the forefront, and I look forward to working with you on that. The trend away from grants to loans. Something that I thought was really interesting coming out of Nevada is basically they're saying that if you want local control, which you always have the ability to do, to think about the city of Artesia. If you want to go do your own projects and you have the money to do it, you have all the control, you go do what you want to do. But if you're asking the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico to contribute, to invest in your project, there should be a set of expectations for everybody in what that means and what you should do over time. Operate, maintain, and keep those facilities running over their life, as an example. So local control equals local responsibility. The other thing that they're doing in Nevada is there is still some grant money available, but they are very closely coupling a commitment to operating and maintaining it to those grant funds. So if the taxpayers are going to finance your project, you need to commit to not being back in front of the taxpayers in 5 years because you let the thing fall apart. That seems reasonable to me. Those kinds of discussions seem reasonable to me. A lot of innovative financing out there. In the past, the private sector, if they wanted to come in and finance projects, they were looking for big returns, right? We want to provide $10 million to your project, and we want to get all of our money paid back in 10 years. The days of that kind of approach are over. Now you're looking at, what they were talking about yesterday was like big pension funds. These big pension funds are looking to invest over a long period of time at lower return. And they're willing to go do that. They're willing to loan lots of money at lower rates in order to have a relatively small return over 50 years. That's a paradigm shift in the way the private investors have looked at doing work over time. Improved accountability, I think we'll probably cover that well enough today. Excellent. Thought that was interesting. The American Society of Civil Engineers nationally does a report card on the nation's infrastructure. And this year, the New Mexico section of ASCE did a report card on New Mexico's infrastructure. And it covers all those things on the left, from aviation to schools and down the road. But Third from the top is drinking water. And over there on the right is what they gave us for drinking water, a C-. Doesn't directly relate to Acequas, but I think it relates to water infrastructure around the state in general. And you can actually see it's a little bit of an improvement from the 2009 grade, which was a D- to a C-. They take a whole bunch of factors into account. And I think we're below average there, but most of the country is. So it's not necessarily just particularly to Mexico. Next. So what does a typical infrastructure project look like? It has these general elements. Conceptualizing what's the need. The planning piece, which I want to keep dragging back to the table. It has design, construction, and then operation and maintenance and replacement. To me, those are all part of a long-term project. Next, please. So here's a little different look at it. With time on the axis, on the horizontal axis, and cost on the vertical axis. The first phase is planning and design. That can be 10% of the cost of a project, roughly, and it can take half to, let's say the construction took a year, it could take half of that, up to a year, in order to get planned and designed. The construction phase is where the bulk of the capital money is spent. That's building it, getting it in place. And then our operation, maintenance, and replacement piece goes on for the usable life of that project. That's something I think for all of us to keep in mind. And that can be 2, 3, 4, 5% a year of the construction cost. If it's $1 million project, you could be talking about needing to put $50,000 a year into keeping it up and running. When we think about the life cycle, when we think about keeping it running, we all need to be thinking about it that way. Next, please. So here are some of the programs that are available. Excuse me, in New Mexico we have roughly 17 or 18 programs for how our state's money is spent. These are examples. It's the program on the left, Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund as an example. The Water Project Fund or the Water Trust Board about 2/3 of the way down through there. The New Mexico Finance Authority over there on the right affectionately calls those groans because they're a combination of grants and loans, and when everybody has to take on a loan, they groan. And you can, I won't go through each one of those, but it gives you a snapshot of the various programs that are out there. Under the last administration, Governor Richardson attempted to create a single path where requests for capital monies would go. The Water Infrastructure Investment, what is it called? The WID, Water Infrastructure Development Department. The idea was that you would apply to the state. It would go through a process with the agencies that had some involvement in those programs, and the agencies would get together working with the entity and say, your best path to success is this route or these two routes. And the idea was really a good one. The implementation never quite got off the ground. So one of the things we're talking about right now is, does that make sense moving ahead? Does it make sense to bring us back to that kind of a methodology? So that the idea is not to say no. The idea is to say, do we have those technical, managerial, fiscal capacity in place? And do we have a program that fits? And if so, let's figure out how to go get that done. Next, please. So if you kind of look at the history of going back to 1996, again, we were working on a statewide drought plan in 96. You can see some of the things that have taken place along the way. Drought Task Force, Water Project Finance Act in 2001 that created the Water Trust Board, the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about House Joint Memorial 86 here in a minute. And that has to do with the criteria that the legislature said you need to have in place in order to get funding from the state. And SWIM is the process that the Environment Department has developed in order to try and do those things. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with, if you've gone through a capital request and you've gone through the Construction Programs Bureau, you've gone through the swimming process with them. Sustainable Water Infrastructure Management, that's what that stands for. Next one. And that's sort of what it looks like. It's a little too bureaucratic for me. I think they created 10 new acronyms along the way in order to explain this. I think their heart's in the right place, and I think it's got really good ideas in it, and probably is going to serve as a good model for rethinking capital. So, next one. So here are the criteria that came out of the legislature, House Joint Memorial 86 in 2005. These are the things that should be considered in looking at how to spend the state's money. Human health and safety. Are we meeting regulations? Are we doing appropriate levels of planning? Asset management. Do we have an O&M plan, operation and maintenance plan and funding, and so forth? Regionalization was a big component to them. Are we leveraging several funding sources together to go get this done? And then are we ready to proceed? Those actually are in place. I'm not sure how good a job we're doing at using them, but they're in place right now. Okay. So I mentioned we're updating the state water plan. It was first developed in 2003. There was an amendment and an update in 2008. We are in the process of updating the components of it as we speak. It is a great opportunity. So what should the state water plan be? I'd love to get your feedback here in a minute when we wrap up. What should it be for New Mexico? In 2003 and 2008, it was more of a policy document. These are kind of the high-level policies that everything's going to get compared against. Infrastructure was a component of it, but infrastructure wasn't a major component of it. And we're rethinking whether or not we should bolster that infrastructure piece in this go-round. I'd love to have your feedback, not only today, but as we roll this out. And, we're finishing New Mexico's first 100 years. What do we want that next 100 years to look like? And how do we get there? And what should those policies be? I was speaking in Lubbock here not too long ago. This was interesting. And there was a group, the High Plains Underground Water District, which serves that Ogallala Aquifer area around Lubbock. And I was talking about some way Texas does business in the High Plains Underground Water District. Their policy is they want 50% of their water left in 50 years. That's planning to run out in 100 years, the way I figure that, right? Mm-hmm. Do we have regions around New Mexico that's what we want? We don't plan to run out in 100 years? We want... Okay. So we're not even having to worry too bad. Do we want to run out in 10, 5 years? How much autonomy do we give to the regions around the state? That's the other thing that we're looking at right now, is revisiting regional water planning. We've asked the legislature to provide us another $400,000 this year to resurrect regional water planning. If the state water plan is supposed to implement the recommendation or give priority to projects that are identified in regional water plans, that implies that we should have a moving regional water plan, that we have the ability to update those over time as we complete things and we add more to them. So I think we had in front of the Legislative Finance Committee this last week. We're trying to get them on board with that, and they seem to be so far. All right, next please. So there I am standing out beside Story Reservoir. And that's where the water level has been in the past years. So moving forward, thinking about capital outlay reform, we're looking at a two-tier process, which is not unlike what the Colonias Fund and the Tribal Infrastructure Fund look like. And that is, we want everybody to have technical, managerial, and fiscal capacity over the long haul to get through that first screen. And if you're not there, we want to help you get there. It's not about saying no, it's about let's figure out how to get you there so that then you're really eligible for those monies, and that those monies, everybody knows, all of us that are paying taxes to get that done, know that it's a good investment of our dollars. The Water Trust Board, we're working on some policy changes there in order to try and line it up with the other programs and to do some of the things we talked about today. Is SWIM, that model is at the basis for moving ahead. It's a good starting place, I can tell you. The other one that all of you should know about, certainly made an impact on us, and is the governor has been very clear to all of us, the agencies that work for the executive, is that if your project has not gone through a vetting process, if it's not been looked at by some process to make sure that it is a good expenditure of the state's funds, she's going to be looking at it to veto that kind of money. She wants it to go through a process so that we're looking at the state water plans go, the regional water plans go, in order to help these projects get. So keep that in mind as you're trying to get projects done, is they need to have gone through an oversight process. They need to have had some vetting along the way in order for the governor and the administration and all of us to feel comfortable that we're doing the right things. So, again, revisiting, are we going to start going back to a single capital outlay process? I'm not sure. It certainly won't happen overnight. It could take a year or two to get something like that in place. Next, please. I think I'll end with my mantra for moving ahead as a state engineer. I'd rather work with all of you to solve stuff rather than fight over it. The amount of dollars that's spent on litigation, no disrespect to the lawyers in the room, is overwhelming. I think there's a better use for those dollars if we can solve it instead of fight over it. And, with that, I thank you for the audience today, and I look forward to working with you down the road.
Let's have another round of applause for Mr. Verhines. Listening to his presentation, I was just reminded why I have such a high regard for the engineering profession. I just have a special place in my heart for engineers. Harold's an engineer too, and because engineers are very pragmatic, and I think that really came through in your presentation. But thank you very much for your solid preparation and your very candid assessment of our water situation. The drought is very daunting, and those of you that are dealing with drought in your daily lives know very, very well what Mr. Verhines was talking about as far as the challenges and the limited and scarce supplies that we're dealing with. And yet we endure because of faith and hope for the future. But it also forces us and challenges us to think about how we're going to do things and adapt for the future, not only in terms of our traditional ways of doing things, but also looking at our infrastructure and improving efficiency and things of that nature, and trying to really understand what the state's trying to accomplish as far as active water resource management. And I just wanted to comment really briefly, because one thing that the state engineer mentioned is that where did Acequas come out or fall out on the debate over AWRM? We call it AWRM, Active Water Resource Management. And when the law was passed in 2003, we were very, very involved in the debate over the language in that statute. And that statute was the one where the state legislature directed the state engineer and said, adjudication is taking too long, you need to do something to protect senior water rights. You also need to do something to, from what I understood, expedite the transfer of water. And I don't know how many people remember or have been around long enough, but in 2003, that's when we were working on our Acequas laws too, the transfer law. And I was at the legislature, and I was pregnant with my son. I was about this big, about here. And at the legislature, and this bill came up. It was toward the end of the session. And our attorney, David Benavides, brought to our attention, he said, "Oh, you got to look at this. It's pretty serious. It's a big, big deal." And so I wasn't able to be at the roundhouse anymore. We called up the Conservation Committee, and I said, we were not comfortable with the expedited markets piece, but the priority administration part of the bill sounds really important. And so that was the extent of our intervention, I remember, in that legislative process. because we really didn't want to discourage the legislature or the state engineer from trying to be innovative and try to do priority administration with the option to do alternative administration and do agreements for sharing water. So we think that there's some tools in place for that now. But I just wanted to call to your attention this idea that the state engineer is developing that Scott mentioned about district-specific rules. And some of those 7 priority basins, some of you in the room are from those basins. And there's a Gainas, so raise your hand if you're from Gainas. So St. Clair, Scott Verhines can see you. And what about Rio Chama? We've got some folks from Rio Chama. And from MPT, Nambe, Pawakit, Suki over here. So in your basins, it's going to be real important to be engaged in this process of doing these district-specific rules and regs. I also want to call your attention, in case he hasn't been introduced yet, Richard Trujillo's here, and he's the community liaison. And I would anticipate that he'll probably help to facilitate communication between these priority basins and developing these rules and regulations. Just one more comment, and I'm going to open it up to questions to the state engineer, that we have, the leadership of NMAA has been meeting. We had 2 meetings this summer on policy issues, and the same issues that Mr. Verhines went over about infrastructure funding and capital outlay reform have really been very present in our discussions and have been prioritized. So if you look at the resolutions we're contemplating and putting before the Congreso today for your approval, they have to do exactly with those issues of infrastructure funding reform, capital outlay reform, and wanting to make sure that the needs of Acequas are considered in the process of figuring out how to allocate state and local dollars in the most efficient way possible. One way that we contribute to this is through the ICIP planning process, and every year some 30 to 40 Acequas do ICIPs. So we're trying to do our part for the planning process, but a lot of what Mr. Verhines said about the upfront technical, managerial, and fiscal capacity are the same conclusions we've come to, that we really want to make sure that Acequas have that capacity in order to have be able to carry out a successful project. So I think we're really in alignment on those things, and those reforms are really timely, and I think a lot of entities are coming to a lot of the same conclusions about what we need to do to proceed. And then the state water plan. So we're going to open it up to questions, and keeping in mind these key areas, the active water resource management, infrastructure, and the state water plan. If you have specific input for the state engineer in those areas, or if you have questions for him, this is a good time. And knowing that he was going to be here today, maybe some of you have some burning questions or comments and thoughts you want to share with him. So we're going to turn it over to you, and thank Mr. Verhines for graciously coming today and sharing his presentation and his thoughts, and being brave and to be here and hear from you, and open to have an open mind to hear from you. So I'm going to start over here with Maurice. Oh, we'll have Facundo first, and then Maurice. Facundo's always first.
I'm one of the younger people here, so I'm going to ask a question that relates to the future, because I feel that I'm going to be around for a good long while yet. And basically, when you had that list of things, you had an item that said future concerns. And it seems to me that it was gone over very rapidly, because I've had experience with regionalization, I've had experience with planning bodies and some of those outfits, and there's always something, because them that have get, them that don't have never get the things that should be given to them. That's always been the process. I'm sorry to say it that way. I didn't get that from Mark. I got that from being all around New Mexico. I wanted to find out if there's a plan for a future water plan, how the concept of population growth is going to be addressed in New Mexico, because New Mexico probably is already reaching the limit where they can keep a population. The last time that there was a water plant, 2 items were addressed: development and economic development. And that, if they go that direction again, it means that we're going to be sucking ID again. Because basically, that's the way they end up doing. And I would just like to raise the water plant. Somehow or other, they have to find a way to incorporate additional people rather than just the top bananas that exist up here. Because that's what they did the last time. And they did it in Socorro most of the time in the university there, because professors end up having a lot of opinions. They're no different than lawyers. And basically, that's why I say it's necessary that somehow or other those that don't have. There's a good saying in Spanish, but I can't say it because people might think that I'm a very outspoken individual. And al chingado chingado y al jodedor dalo libre. To address some of those future concerns. I know that I shut up and I'm going to sing a song.
Let me do my best. Well, the first thing I would say, that bullet that I had on there about future concerns was relative to the drought. And what I put that on there to say is that New Mexicans have concerns about the future based on where this drought is going, whether climate change and continuation of the drought. When we're traveling around New Mexico, what we're hearing is concerns about the future. With regard to population control, that's way above my pay grade. Those are policy decisions of which water is a factor. Not the only factor, but it is a factor. And it's something that all of the West is struggling with. Well, it's not just the West, I can tell you. Even the East Coast, even following Atlanta and other areas where they've never seen drought before, now they're going through it, and it's made a huge impact on their future as well. So your comments are well noted. I can also say that it's not just professors around New Mexico that are opinionated. There's plenty of water is a very personal thing, right? It's not, and so there's no lack of opinions, and that's what I was talking about at the state water plant and the state water conference down in Las Cruces. Every value of water that you can imagine was represented there. How do we balance the historical, cultural value of water with the growing needs of our population as well? That's a tricky thing. And that's where you need to weigh in. That's where you need to provide feedback and advice to us on what that state water plan, what do we want that next 100 years to look like in New Mexico. But that bullet was specifically was acknowledging that around New Mexico, folks are concerned about the future. And rightfully so. If this drought continues like this, we'll have a very different shift in our thinking about lawns and how we spend. What we spend money on golf courses, all
golf course.
Yeah. So, thank you.
I want to thank the state engineer. I don't know, there's a few of us that got to go meet with him this year. And I got to tell you, we spent, an hour and a half? And he took notes and he listened. He didn't do very much talking at all. And it's a real pleasure to meet with a public official that's willing to listen. we can work together to facilitate the use. I think with Acequas, I don't know how much of the water we actually administer, but it's a huge part of your job. And if you have another guy out there doing that, with the little interplay between the neighbors cutting in on each other and everything, I would think I would want a friend like that, like the Acequas. So we hope we can work together and we can use the water in New Mexico and save water so we don't waste it. We want to be sure if you have any questions or need any information from us, that you feel free to contact us, even at our Acequia levels, because there's a lot of information out there, a lot of history, and we want you to have that knowledge.
Just a comment on that.
Yes.
I can tell you, Paula is a great advocate for all of you, and she's kind of like radar for MASH. When I start thinking about something, she's already there to answer it.
Yes. And we're very proud of her and her job that she's doing. But to us, she represents a way of life, a culture, custom and culture, and it's us. And we don't want to lose it because Albuquerque wants to be 1 million or 2 million people. I know that's jobs and everything, but we have a culture and a custom that we have had in New Mexico for centuries, and we shouldn't lose it. And I guess it goes back to that age-old question of agriculture versus, we show up with 77% of the water use, and everybody says, ooh, that's the evil person or the evil entity that's using all the water. Well, when we quit farming, who's going to feed all those people? And so we need to have our interests balanced. And I don't know, you kind of have the same question. And I appreciate Mr. Valdez in his question because it's the same thing. And acequias are important in New Mexico. And so if you have kind of an opinion, a real quick answer to that, I know it's a lot of comments, but we hope we can preserve this beautiful culture we have.
The cultural value of water in New Mexico, not just in northern New Mexico, but my mom grew up on a cotton and alfalfa farm down southeast of Artesia. I have cut, baled, and hauled a lot of hay over the years, and so I understand that connection to the land very well. It's important. I have to chuckle a little bit though when I hear that comment made about who's going to feed the future, because a lot of my friends from that part of New Mexico, when the opportunity has come up to sell a little water off the farm to oil and gas and make 50 cents a barrel for that, they have jumped all over it.
Yes.
And they're making a lot of money doing it. So that's, again, it's a very personal value, decision value that you all make. It's not lost on me the importance. The Western States Water Council meeting that we were at this last week, that very issue was talked about for 3 days. And most states are headed down the path of recognizing the importance of agriculture to their economy and the way of life and culture and all that. At the same time, providing mechanisms for water to move from one use to another if there's a willing buyer and a willing seller for that. I understand that the Acequia community has a different perspective about that. And it's not lost in your advocacy for the community, for the way of life. It's one of those values that's important to you. I think it's not lost on the legislature, not lost on our administration. But is it important to other parts of New Mexico that those transfers have a mechanism to take place if those parties want to do it? So the balancing of those values is what is the difficult part of water use in New Mexico, no doubt about it. But it's not lost on any of us.
Thank you.
I'm Lynn Montgomery. I'm a on the Acequas de Castilla, which is on Las Huertas Creek near the village of Casitas. I'm also supervisor on Coronado Soil and Water Conservation District, and I represent traditional, cultural, and historical interests to the board of the Middle Rio Grande Water Assembly. I was going to ask you about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but somebody told me that that was a taboo subject, and I shouldn't talk about it, or anybody should. So I will state that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo appears in our Constitution amongst our provisions for our rights, in our Bill of Rights. Those rights are granted to us to be preserved inviolate, and that any regulations or anything like that are inferior to the treaty, and I hope that your office recognizes that and makes sure that our rights are put to the wayside, and that the treaty will come forward and have a larger presence in the future, because I think it's a valuable tool to resolving our problems. What I'm going to talk about or ask you about is in Casitas we have very limited aquifers, and a lot of permits have been granted for domestic wells. And it's a very small place, so all these domestic wells are impairing my water rights, which depend on a spring, and that spring was our rights were adjudicated as far as quantity goes on January 5th, 1912, the first legal day of statehood. We're celebrating our centennial also. Our prior day we claimed 1765. We are in a land grant. We have all those elements. And, recently, the Court of Appeals ruled on the Bounds case, and within the ruling was a statement that people like me can sue you if we feel or we can prove that our water rights are being impaired by permits you have written. And so I was preparing to do that. I sued you before, and spent my ways.
The party getting bigger.
So anyway, instead of suing you, at least for the moment, I come up with something, a lot of us have come up with something, and that is water harvesting. And a lot of our residents harvest their water, and even in this drought year, they didn't run out of water. They didn't have to pump their wells at all. So I was impressed by that. And so what happened was the Coronado District and a private nonprofit, New Mexico Water Collaborative, got together, and we're now doing a pilot project where we're putting water harvesting and other conservation measures in to 7 households in Casitas. And we're planning on moving out into the whole district, which is Rio, Verhines, County of Verhines, and all the pueblos along the river that are in our district. And so we're right in the middle of doing that, and we're seeking funding from DOR, and they've been very receptive. Now, this is it's not new because it's one of the oldest sources of water in humanity, but this is a new source of water. And the problem with it is it's very decentralized, and our governments and bureaucracies don't like to do decentralized things. Some might say that because they see it as a loss of power and control, but that's not really the case. And so we need to know or ask you about 2 things. And one is that it's absolutely necessary if we're going to do this to get our grant funding and everything. We need a meter on every one of our wells, and we require it of all our clients. And we're hoping that the state engineer will start to promulgate regulations and requirements that all wells have a flow meter on that we can ascertain how much water is being used. And that's a critical figure that we have to have. So we want that, and we'd also like you to continue letting us do this, and and defending us against any other states or anybody that would want to challenge that as
sure I got that right. You want me to take you on this one while you're getting ready to sue me on it.
So, this is a carrot stick. So if we get enough of these projects going, and it gets to be a big deal, and a majority of our people are harvesting their water, using it, then it might mitigate their pumping, and we won't have to fight. We can just keep building this new resource.
Let me quickly address a couple of things there. One is we're kind of caught in this no man's land until the Supreme Court decides on the bound case as well. And we're hopeful that'll happen sooner rather than later. I have a set of draft domestic well regulations sitting on our desk that I've just started looking at. Staff has brought and said, this is where we think we need to go once that decision is made, depending upon the outcome of that. So I'll be working on that. The other one is with regard to water harvesting. We have water harvesting policies on the boards today. It exists already. And what we're looking at that. I was speaking to working with the City Managers Association here recently. They basically said, we're caught in the middle between two agencies. On one hand, EPA is saying, like particularly for commercial development, we don't want you to let any water leave your site because of the contamination that could come along with it and end up in the river. We want you to hold all that. And under our rules, we're saying can't do that. That's somebody else's water. In the absence of your property and your commercial development being there, that would have been somebody else's water. So one of the things we're going to be working on here near term is trying to come up with how do we balance that over the long haul. And but I'd ask you to be considerate of the current policies that are on the table, because we wouldn't want to get in trouble with you or us. So we'll have to work on that with you. That's the balance case. We're waiting on the outcome. There's a lot of issues around New Mexico with the number of domestic wells that are in certain basins that are allegedly impairing their neighbors. So we're definitely wanting to get that one resolved so we can move forward. So, thank you.
Jim Henning.
Thank you. Please, can you elaborate slightly on the vetting process that you referenced earlier and how to accomplish that vetting? This is pertinent to acquisition funding.
I think the vetting. The question is, what kind of vetting processes are we talking about for the acquisition of capital funding? I think it can take several forms, and it sort of depends on what the particular project, the route that the project is trying to be implemented under. If it's water supply related, it tends to go through the Construction Programs Bureau through their SWIM process. That's a vetting process. The concern by the governor in the administration is where a legislator, basically somebody goes to a legislator and says, we need $250,000 for a soccer field complex in Roswell. And it doesn't go through any body's plan. In fact, in a lot of cases, it doesn't even go through the city of Roswell's plan. They don't even know about it. And this very example happened a few years ago. I was sitting with the city engineer in Roswell, and he said, we're not sure what to do about this. We got a check in the mail from the legislature for $150,000 for soccer field improvement. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know where it came from. So that happens many times around New Mexico. So I think through a preliminary engineering report process, an ICIP, through the Water Trust Board process, through SWIM, those are the vetting processes that we're talking about. And even let's say, for example, there was a project that went through Water Trust Board, and the legislator said, we may want to add some of our money to the pot. It has gone through a vetting process. All we're talking about is trying to add some additional money to get that to another phase. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained that very well, but instead of just being direct special appropriations, that nobody's had an opportunity to say, does this fit the big picture that we're trying to accomplish in that region? That's what it's about. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sigmund Silver, and I'm kind of an water activist, although I don't live on Acequas, but we do have a farm, a little farm, and in fact, I can't even walk around my living room right now, but Julia has piles of wool all over the place, trying to pull them apart. We're getting ready to carve them. We're ready to churro sheep. I have a technical question. As you probably know, I'm data free. And I observed this year that the auto-way flow didn't seem to be consistent with the precipitation numbers that were reported. Auto-way flow would seem to be a lot less. Now that's the auto-way flow, but I have to figure that if there's a problem there, there's a problem with the tributaries, which affects the Acequas. So I'm wondering if we have a problem with snow melt getting down from the mountains into the tributaries, into the Acequas, etc. So I'm just suggesting that that's a research topic that maybe somebody will take.
And let me address a little bit about what I know about that, because we followed it pretty closely. The snowpack this year, while we had snowpack, it was unfortunate that it came off the mountain about 5 to 6 weeks earlier than an average year. So the combination of temperatures and the state climatologist said we had a lot of wind and we had a lot of dust laid out across the top of the snowpack, which increased the loss in a hurry. So the combination of what was lost to ET and what was lost to early runoff, it came off so fast that it was before the planting season, it was before the irrigation season started, and folks had a hard time putting it to use. And if our climate is changing in that same way, or the drought is forcing snowmelt to happen at an earlier stage, we all need to be rethinking about how we deal with storage and use of diversions and all that down the road.
Yeah, well, and that's my point. And by the way, I've seen those studies. I'm not sure I buy them 100%. They may be right, but I'd like to see better quantification on that. But let's say they are right. If we suspect that this may be an ongoing situation, that it's not a one-time event, that the climate might be changing in a way that this is going to be a permanent situation, maybe we have to come up with some new approaches to getting that water down from the mountains, maybe stored, find some other ways that it becomes more available to the Acequas. So I still think it's worthy of not just explaining why it happened, which is a good start. I agree with you. I'm almost on 80 years old. I have the same point of view. But also what we might be able to do to improve the situation. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Okay, on this, and then we're going to come up to the stage to finish off. So, go ahead.
Yes, my wife says, don't say nothing, but I always talk. Anyway, the first comment I want to make is I really like the way you presented the situations here, because you are the head of the thing, and we're very proud of it. Yes, I am anyway. But I have a few things. The first thing that I would, and I've heard a few people talk about, the water. Do we have a state that's fighting with us for water, for the water entities? Another state? I know what it is, but do you know what it is?
I'm not sure
But the question is, our waters from our rivers are emptying into another state. Which state is that? That's why I forgot.
Our buddies to the east.
Who are they? Yes. Okay. Now, we are in a drought. I have an idea. Well, I've had it all this time for a while now since I've been in the Acequas. And I brought it up in the meetings that we've had or whatever. But you know, we're in a drought. And instead of letting the water flow through the eastern state, I think the arroyos that are floating after it rains, you know, they just empty to the rivers and go down east or wherever it's going. But we're not conserving that. And I think that if we get our arroyos and build some kind of dams up there and preserve water for the acequias, and maybe even use those for, like when I was in the Game and Fish Commission, you know, I brought up a few things that they're still existing, and I'm very proud of them, like the free fishing days that we had in New Mexico. That was my idea. And the other thing that I brought up was having all these things for the handicapped in the mountains and that. Well, that was my idea also. So I'm bringing up the idea of maybe getting our arroyos with some kind of hold up the water and save it for the acequas or whatever else we need, and also use them maybe for some kind of fishing or something like that. And I think that helps. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have the best day, everybody.
Untitled Sanchez, one of the parties working with the Rio Chiapas Association on the Acequas Maintenance. We always have some conversation there. But what I have is probably a question and also maybe a proposal. Since the state engineer is in charge of the water in Mexico, how about instituting, and I don't know whether you have the authority or not, instituting some requirements for developments. And we're going to be seeing in New Mexico in terms of requiring these municipalities to develop recycling systems in terms of water that